get her hands on her husband's fortune. The woman secretly slipped a rare poison into his coffee, but just as she did it, her husband suddenly walked up beside her, and the shock made Laura fumble the small vial right onto the floor. Luckily Nick didn't notice a thing. A moment later, Nick picked up his coffee and headed to the dinner table. Over a romantic candlelit meal, he suggested they raise their cups together in a toast, but Laura had been so rattled that she'd completely lost track of which cup had the poison. In it she had no way of knowing whether the coffee in Nick's hand was the tainted one, so she faked feeling under the weather and said she didn't want any coffee, but it was their 60th wedding anniversary after all, and stubborn as ever, Nick insisted she take at least a sip. There was no way Laura was going to gamble with her own life. As the two of them went back and forth, Nick suddenly started feeling wrong. It hit him immediately. Someone had tampered with his coffee, but it was already too late. He let out an agonizing scream and collapsed to the floor. To Laura's surprise, he didn't die right away. Instead, he dragged himself toward her, begging her to save him, but all Laura's face showed was fear, not an ounce of pity. 5 hours later, Nick finally stopped breathing for good. The first call Laura made was to her therapist. As it turned out, the two of them had been carrying on a secret affair for some time to get their hands on Nick's wealth. The lovers had extracted a toxin from a rare species of fish. This particular poison could trigger sudden cardiac arrest and was nearly impossible to detect. When the police arrived at the scene, nothing seemed obviously out of place, but the sheriff in charge couldn't shake his doubts. He'd never heard of Nick having any heart condition, and a sudden cardiac death just didn't add up. Meanwhile, Paul, the therapist, showed up acting perfectly composed. He volunteered an explanation to the officers, suggesting that Nick had most likely suffered a sudden stroke, since that sort of thing wasn't all that uncommon. But then, Paul spotted something that made his blood run cold. The little vial of poison was still lying on the floor. He never expected Laura to be this careless. As the sheriff started walking in that direction, step by step, the color drained from both Laura's and Paul's faces. By sheer luck, the sheriff stopped short, with no clear evidence of foul play. He and the forensics team agreed that it appeared to be a sudden medical emergency. No autopsy necessary. Nick's body was sent straight to the funeral home to be prepared for burial. What no one expected was that Laura, his own wife, chose the cheapest funeral package available. Left with no choice, the funeral home staff gave Nick a beat-up old casket, patched it up, slapped on a fresh coat of paint, and laid him inside. After the funeral, Laura and Paul settled right into their new life together. But what they never could have imagined was that on a stormy night, drenched in pouring rain, Nick suddenly woke up inside that casket. The toxin hadn't actually killed him. It had thrown him into a death-like state of shock, mimicking all the signs of passing. As rainwater seeped deeper into the soil, Nick threw a punch and smashed right through the rotting wood. Moments later, a mud-caked hand slowly broke through the surface, and Nick clawed his way out of his own grave. Burning with rage, Nick headed straight home, hell-bent on revenge. But what he found was even harder to stomach. Paul was already shacked up with his wife. The betrayal, the conspiracy to murder him, it all sent his fury through the roof. Still, he held back. He wasn't going to act on impulse. Meanwhile, Laura caught a glimpse of a shadow passing by the window, and immediately went pale. Paul, on the other hand, just figured it was some stray dog howling outside. After Paul left, Nick quietly smashed a basement window and slipped inside, spending a long miserable night in the cold, damp cellar. The next morning, Laura wasted no time. She started the process of selling off Nick's company assets. At the same time, Nick, starving by now, crept up to the kitchen and started digging through the fridge for some leftover KFC. He'd barely taken a few bites when he spotted Laura pulling back into the driveway. Nick rushed back down to the basement, where he found some firearms and began mapping out his plan for revenge. But right about then, Paul showed up at the house too, hiding in the shadows. Nick overheard every word of their conversation, the full extent of their plot to kill him. His rage only grew, but he still didn't make his move. He had no intention of letting them off that easy. As night fell and Laura drifted off to sleep, Nick tended to his wounds. He changed into a clean set of clothes and officially set his plan in motion. Since the company had already been sold, Laura collected a cool $5 million. The next day, she could barely contain her excitement, completely oblivious to the danger closing in around her. Meanwhile, the cemetery groundskeeper discovered that Nick's body had mysteriously vanished. They assumed some disturbed individual had stolen the corpse, but the sheriff sensed there was more to it. He ordered the cemetery staff to keep it quiet, not a word to anyone, until the investigation was complete. Laura, still riding high on her windfall, gradually started noticing that something felt off around the house. When she walked into the bathroom, she found dirt tracked all over the floor and a used towel tossed aside. It hit her instantly. Someone had been inside the house. In a panic, she ran outside and called Paul, but Paul's phone just rang and rang with no answer. Gripping a metal rod, Laura nervously crept downstairs to check things out. Out of nowhere, Nick's dog started barking like crazy at her, as if the animal knew exactly what she'd done. Rattled to her core, Laura made her way to the basement door, ready to shoot the dog if she had to. But right at that moment, a man in a mask stepped out of the darkness. Startled, Laura fired a shot on instinct. The recoil was so powerful it knocked her off balance, and she tumbled all the way down the basement stairs. Nick behind the mask didn't have a scratch on him. Laura was out cold. Nick locked Laura in the basement and nailed boards over the only window she could escape through. Meanwhile, Paul extracted a fresh dose of toxin from that same rare fish. The truth was, his interest in Laura had never been about love. It had always been about the money. Paul was drowning in debt and couldn't even make bank rent anymore. This time, he planned to use the same method to get rid of Laura. When Paul arrived at the house, Laura was nowhere to be found, but when he stepped into the bedroom, he spotted the pile of cash, sitting right there on the bed. The temptation was instant. He could just grab the money and run, but just then Laura came to in the basement. At the same time, Nick deliberately unlocked the basement door for her. When Paul headed downstairs, he sensed something was off in the basement, and went in to investigate. Laura meanwhile was hiding under the staircase. She assumed the masked man from earlier was Paul, since Paul was the one holding the money. Completely blindsided, Paul took a hit from Laura, who swung a weapon and dropped him to the floor. She snatched the bag of cash and made for the exit, but the next second, Nick appeared and Laura froze in her tracks. Nick shoved both of them back into the basement, and locked the door. When Paul came to, the two of them realized someone had been watching their every move, but they still had no idea who was behind the mask. Paul grabbed a weapon, and tried to force the basement lock open, only to discover that every round in the gun had been swapped out with blanks. They tried smashing the boards off the window next, but Nick's dog stood guard outside, watching their every move. Strange banging noises echoed from upstairs, putting them even more on edge. What they didn't know was that Nick was up there remodeling the entire house, trapped in the basement. They had no clue what the masked man was planning. 3 days later the basement door finally swung open. The two of them grabbed the cash and bolted for the main hall, only to find that the entire house had been transformed into a narrow, pitch-black corridor, sealed off on every side with boards and drywall. Just as they tried to negotiate with the masked figure, a hidden door slammed shut behind them. That's when it finally clicked. They were the prey. And this was a sadistic game of cat and mouse. Plunged into darkness, the only light they had was the faint flicker of a lighter. Before long a hidden door creaked open ahead of them, and they had no choice but to press forward. But they barely made it a few steps before another door crashed down behind them, trapping them once again. It finally dawned on them. The masked man was toying with them on purpose. Paul lost it, and started pounding on the walls in frustration. But the next instant, a thick wooden panel rose up between them, splitting the two apart completely. Before either could react, a hidden door behind Paul slowly swung open. The light streaming through made him think he'd found the way out, but he had no idea. The masked man was already waiting for him. On the other side, Paul tried to keep his cool, revealing the syringe he'd been hiding in his hand. He attempted to talk his way out, offering to hand over every last dollar if the masked man would just let him go. But nothing could have prepared him for what came next. The man standing before him was Nick, the man who was supposed to be dead. The sight of Nick scared Paul so badly, his legs gave out, and he crumpled to the ground. As he fell, his body landed on the syringe in his hand, and the toxin shot straight into his own veins. In that final moment, Paul understood. He'd met the very fate he'd designed for others. Paul's blood-curdling screams echoed through the corridors, and Laura, trapped on the other side, knew things were getting worse by the second. A hidden door in front of her suddenly swung open, and all she could do was stumble backward in terror. Then the door behind her opened too, and the masked figure appeared right before her eyes. With nowhere left to run, Laura bolted in the only direction she could, squeezing into a narrow, suffocating passage. But Laura had no idea. All of this was exactly what Nick had planned. When she finally crawled to the end of the passage, a panel above her came crashing down, sealing off any way back. She was a rat in a trap with no way out. Nick finally removed his mask and told her cold as ice that he was going to personally see her off on her final journey. In her last moments of despair, Laura was sealed alive inside the cramped wooden box. Afterward, Nick doused the entire house in gasoline and struck a match, burning it all to the ground and destroying every last piece of evidence. He completed his revenge in the same brutal fashion it had begun. The next day when police arrived at the scene, they'd write it off as nothing more than an accidental house fire, but there was one strange. They couldn't find a single body in the wreckage, and that was the moment everything clicked for the sheriff. During his earlier investigation of Nick's coffin, he'd already noticed that the hole in the lid had been punched out from the inside. Nick's body hadn't been stolen. He dug his own way out. Now this fire only confirmed what the sheriff had begun to suspect. Nick's so-called accidental death had been a carefully orchestrated murder plot all along. When the sheriff finally made it to the town cemetery, he found exactly what he expected. Nick had completed his revenge and buried the two bodies in his own grave. As Nick's longtime friend, the sheriff chose not to arrest him. Instead, he told Nick to get out of town and start a new life somewhere else. As for this terrible secret, the sheriff buried it forever beneath that cold stretch of earth.